A dog is a man's best friend. Well, that's what they say anyway. Well, this is the story of a dog who was the best friend to over 100,000 men, the US postal workers of the late 1800s. This dog was so famous he became a household name. He was followed by newspaper reporters, and he even traveled around the world and earned himself an award. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning. Our story begins in Albany, New York in 1888. It was a cold, rainy night, and a little homeless dog who was so skinny and wet and cold nosed his way into the back of the Albany post office, looking for a warm and dry place to sleep. Well, he found it on top of some empty mail bags. In those days, mail bags were made out of leather, and surprised the mailmen when they came in the morning. But since they saw the door open a crack, figured out where he'd come from. Well, of course they tried to find out who he belonged to and where he lived, but nobody seemed to know anything about him, and he didn't want to go anywhere. So after a few days of loving care and cleaning him up and feeding him, this dog decided he was going to stay there. He was especially partial to the mailmen, though he was friendly to everybody who came in, and they finally decided they better name him. So, nobody knows who, somehow he was named Owney. And Owney became a famous name in the 1890s as he became the US Postal Mascot. So, I'll tell you how that happened, because he didn't just sit around in the post office in Albany, New York. He had bigger plans. He loved to hang out with the mailmen, as I said earlier. He went with them on their routes, but his favorite job was to ride the horse-drawn cart that took the mail bags to the railway station. There, the bags were loaded onto the various trains that came in and went off on their journey to their final homes, and mail was traded there. And each railway car had a railroad clerk, a postal clerk, who had his kind of office in there where he'd sort the mail, and he'd ride the trains and throw the bags out at various parts and pick up mail at each of the various stops. Well, Owney was very friendly to these mailmen as well. They had the same uniforms, and one day Owney decided to jump on board the train. Well, that was a surprise to the men in Albany. They were glad he had a name tag on him that said Owney, Post Office, Albany, New York, because they wanted to see him back again. Well, the New York City man said that he would make sure Owney got on the next train back to Albany, and off they went, down to New York City. Owney had a wonderful time there with the mailmen in New York, going with them on their beats and seeing all of New York, and after a few days, he was put on a train back to Albany, and the men there were happy to see him. Well, they realized he might do this again. He seemed to like the train ride. So they added a tag to his collar that said, Owney is friends to all the mailmen. He lives in Albany, New York. Please take care of him, and add your depot tag to his collar so we know where he's been. And sure enough, in a few days, off Owney goes on another train. This time he's gone for several weeks. When he comes back, he has quite a few tags on his collar, and it's getting harder to even hold his head up. So they had a special harness made for him with straps that went around his chest and across his back so that they could spread the weight of these metal depot tags that were being attached. And Owney liked that a lot. It was easier for him to walk, and he made a nice jingling sound when he went. Well, we could see from the tags that he was all over the United States, from Washington to Texas to Chicago to Kentucky and up to Maine, back and forth, crisscrossing and stopping at all the little towns in between. He even made it to Mexico and all the way up to Canada. Of course, when he got to Montreal, they decided that he had entered the country illegally and sent a letter to Albany asking for them to pay a $2.50 fine to have Owney released from the pound, which the men gladly did. and then he was sent on a train back to Albany. Well, he was getting quite a lot of attention with all these trips. And somewhere along the line, somebody decided that they would treat Owney to a trip around the world. He started in Tacoma, Washington, and he was put on a boat that went to Japan. He had a special registered dog package rate, and when he got to Japan, after his very relaxing boat ride, which he seemed to quite enjoy since he had lots of time to nap on the mail bags, which was one of his favorite activities, that along with rat catching. But when he got to Japan, they gave him a very nice welcome, and they issued him an imperial passport. This passport, of course, did have some restrictions, which he had to abide by. First, he was not allowed to ride a horse to a fire, he was not allowed to rent a house, and he was not allowed to scribble on buildings. Well, Owney had no problem following those rules. After all, he was a US postal worker and a law-abiding citizen. After he spent some time in Japan, he went on to Hong Kong and Singapore, and even got to Egypt and to see the pyramids, something I've never actually been able to do yet. It amazes me that a dog who can actually talk was taken care of and managed to get all the way around the world. Well, after he was in Egypt, he went through the Mediterranean and stopped in Algiers and the Azores, and then ended up on the east coast of the United States, where he was then put on a train back to Tacoma. 132 days his trip took, went completely around the world, start to finish in Tacoma. Very impressive. And I'm not the only one who thought that was impressive. The San Francisco Dog Show organizers also thought that, and they gave him an award and a medal that was for the greatest dog traveler in the world. Made headlines. That award made headlines as well. Well, at this point, Owney had gained 6 pounds on his trip, and he had also gained 200 more tags on that trip. He was getting a little old, and was getting a little stiff. It was harder for him to move. He was losing some of his teeth. They decided it was time for him to retire back in Albany, where he began. And he was happy to do that. He spent a lot of days sleeping curled up on mail bags, his favorite place to sleep, and relaxed, and he was a little bit too hard to jump on the trains now. When he died in 1897, he was so well liked. When he had gone to, just before his death, he had gone to the railway clerks convention and was given a 15-minute standing ovation. Well, money was raised for him, and his body was preserved. A taxidermist stuffed him, and he is actually on display at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. at the Postal Museum. The preserved body of Owney and all his tags. You can check them out there and read some more about his legacy. So that's the story of Owney the Mail Dog, the US Postal Mascot. I think that was a pretty impressive thing for a dog to do all on his own.